Why is it that the mind often becomes most active at the very moment we attempt to sleep? Throughout the day, attention is occupied by tasks, conversations, and responsibilities, yet once external stimulation disappears and the lights are turned off, many people experience a surge of mental activity. Thoughts replay the events of the day. Concerns about tomorrow begin to surface. Minor worries suddenly appear much larger. From a neuroscientific perspective, this phenomenon is linked to the default mode network, a system of interacting brain regions that becomes active when the mind is not focused on a specific task, when external demands decrease. The brain shifts into internal processing. This often results in rumination, emotional reflection, and self-evaluation. Interestingly, long before modern neuroscience described these mechanisms, spiritual traditions had already developed practices designed specifically for this transitional moment before sleep. Within Islamic tradition, reciting Ayat al-Kursi before sleep has long been recommended. However, scholars such as Ibn Arabi did not interpret this act as a simple ritual performed mechanically. For him, the effectiveness of such recitation depended fundamentally on the state of consciousness in which it was performed. In other words, the psychological and spiritual impact of the verse is not determined merely by repetition. It is determined by how the mind engages with its meaning. In this lecture, we will examine how reciting Ayat al-Kursi before sleep can influence attention, emotional regulation, and mental perception, particularly when understood through the philosophical framework of Ibn Arabi. To understand the significance of this practice, it is important to examine the psychological condition of the modern mind at night. Consider the environment in which most people live today. Modern life exposes the brain to an unprecedented level of cognitive stimulation. Smartphones deliver constant notifications. Social media platforms continuously trigger novelty responses. Work-related communication often continues well into the evening hours. From the perspective of cognitive neuroscience, this creates a state of sustained cognitive arousal. The brain remains engaged in processing information long after the day's activities should have ended. As a result, many individuals struggle to transition from active thinking into restful sleep. Psychologists also identify a phenomenon known as rumination loops. These loops involve repetitive thought patterns in which the mind replays negative experiences or anticipates future threats. The brain attempts to solve problems or predict outcomes, but often without reaching resolution. During rumination, the amygdala, a structure involved in emotional processing, becomes highly active. This maintains physiological stress responses, even when the body is physically resting. Another important factor is the absence of cognitive closure. Throughout history, many cultures developed evening rituals designed to psychologically conclude the day. These rituals signaled to the mind that activity was ending and rest was beginning. Modern lifestyles often lack such transitions. Consequently, the mind enters sleep still carrying unresolved narratives from the day. This is precisely where the philosophical framework of Ibn Arabi becomes relevant. Within his understanding of consciousness, sacred recitation functions as a structured transition between states of awareness. To appreciate this perspective, It is useful to briefly consider who Ibn Arabi was and how he understood the nature of human awareness. Ibn Arabi lived between 1165 and 1240 and is widely regarded as one of the most influential thinkers in Islamic metaphysics and spiritual psychology. His writings, including Futuhat al-Makkiyah and Fusius al-Hikam, explored the relationship between perception, consciousness, and divine reality. A central idea in his thought is that human experience is shaped not only by external circumstances, but by states of awareness. In Ibn Arabi's framework, the human heart referred to as kalbis, not merely an emotional center. It is a perceptual organ capable of recognizing deeper layers of reality. When attention is scattered or dominated by fear, perception becomes narrow and fragmented. When attention becomes centered and aligned with meaning, perception expands. From this perspective, reciting sacred verses performs a psychological function. It reorganizes the hierarchy of attention within the mind. The verse known as Ayat al-Kursi describes a reality in which divine knowledge encompasses all existence. Divine authority sustains the universe, and divine awareness never sleeps. When the mind engages deeply with these ideas, its perception of control, uncertainty, and vulnerability begins to shift. In modern psychology, there is a concept known as cognitive reframing. This technique involves changing the interpretation of a situation in order to reduce emotional distress. For example, a person facing uncertainty at work might initially interpret the situation as a threat. However, when the situation is reframed as an opportunity for adaptation or growth, anxiety often decreases. Ayat al-Kursi performs a similar function on a much broader scale. The verse systematically establishes three central ideas. First, it emphasizes absolute divine authority. Second, it describes divine knowledge, encompassing both past and future. Third, it presents divine protection sustaining all existence. When these ideas are contemplated consciously, they encourage a shift from self-centered threat perception toward a broader, cosmic perspective. Consider a common example. Imagine someone lying in bed worrying about an uncertain future. The typical internal dialogue might sound like this: what if tomorrow goes wrong? What if I lose control of the situation? Such thoughts amplify stress because they assume that the individual mind must anticipate and manage every possible outcome. However, when the mind engages with the message of Ayat al-Kursi, the interpretive framework changes. Instead of assuming total personal responsibility for the future, the individual recognizes that reality operates within a much larger order. In psychological terms, this reduces cognitive stress load. Ibn Arabi summarized this transformation with a simple insight. Certainty reorganizes perception. When the mind recognizes a greater order underlying existence, fear gradually loses its intensity. Another important aspect of this practice involves the regulation of attention. Modern neuroscience has shown that rhythmic vocalization and meditative recitation influence several regions of the brain associated with attention and emotional regulation. In particular, these practices activate the prefrontal cortex, which helps manage impulses and organize thought. At the same time, slow breathing and rhythmic speech stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch of the nervous system responsible for relaxation, and recovery. This is significant because the modern environment constantly fragments attention. Notifications, multitasking, and rapid streams of information create a pattern of mental switching that exhausts cognitive resources. Ibn Arabi emphasized that recitation should be performed with presence rather than mechanical repetition. Each phrase should be spoken deliberately and understood conceptually. When Ayat al-Kursi is recited slowly in this manner, several physiological changes occur. Breathing naturally slows. Neural firing patterns stabilized. The intensity of emotional arousal decreases. These changes prepare the brain for the transition into deeper stages of sleep. In practical terms, the verse becomes a tool for attention stabilization at the precise moment when the mind tends to become most chaotic. Islamic tradition frequently describes Ayat al-Kursi as a source of protection during sleep. Ibn Arabi offered a deeper interpretation of this idea, rather than viewing protection solely as an external shield. He also understood it as the formation of psychological boundaries within the mind. In contemporary psychology, boundaries play a crucial role in mental health. When boundaries are weak, intrusive thoughts and worries easily dominate consciousness. The mind becomes vulnerable to cycles of anxiety. Ayat al-Kursi repeatedly emphasizes divine guardianship and continuous awareness over creation. When these ideas are internalized, they create a mental schema of security. The brain interprets the environment as less threatening. This phenomenon can be observed even in childhood. Development children often sleep more peacefully when they feel protected by a trusted presence. The perception of safety allows the nervous system to relax. Similarly, when the mind adopts a perception of divine guardianship, emotional vigilance decreases. Another crucial factor is the neurological state that occurs immediately before sleep. RECITE refer to this period as the hypnagogic state, during which brain activity transitions from beta waves associated with active thinking to slower alpha and theta rhythms. During this phase, the subconscious mind becomes more receptive to impressions, thoughts and imagery experienced during this period often influence dreams and emotional processing during the night. Ibn Arabi recognized the significance of this transitional state long before modern neuroscience described it. He suggested that the final mental orientation before sleep shapes the inner experiences that follow. Reciting Ayat al-Kursi during this moment introduces structured meaning, calm imagery, and emotional stability into the mind. From a scientific perspective, this can influence memory consolidation, emotional processing, and dream formation. In other words, the mind enters sleep carrying an organized and stabilizing cognitive framework. A common misunderstanding about spiritual practices is the assumption that they operate automatically. Simply repeating words without attention is often assumed to produce the same result as deliberate contemplation. Ibn Arabi strongly rejected this idea. According to his philosophy, the inner state of consciousness determines the effectiveness of any practice. Two individuals may recite the same verse, yet their experiences can differ dramatically depending on their level of awareness. Modern psychology refers to this principle as intentional attention. When attention, meaning, and emotional engagement align, cognitive processes become far more powerful. Therefore, the purpose of recitation is not merely repetition, It is the cultivation of a particular state of awareness. From both traditional teachings and modern psychological research, we can derive a practical method for applying this practice before sleep. First, reduce cognitive stimulation. Turn off electronic screens and dim the lights. This allows the brain to transition toward slower rhythms. Second, regulate breathing. Inhale slowly for approximately 4 seconds and exhale for about 6 seconds. This pattern activates the parasympathetic nervous system and signals the body to relax. Third, recite Ayat al-Kursi slowly and deliberately. Focus not only on pronunciation but on the meaning contained within the verse. Fourth, visualize a state of calm, order, and protection. This strengthens the mental schema of safety described earlier. Finally, release the need to mentally control the future. Recognize that existence continues according to a larger order beyond individual planning. This final cognitive shift reduces what psychologists call control anxiety, allowing the mind to rest. The teachings of Ibn Arabi suggest that reciting Ayat al-Kursi before sleep is far more than a ritual. It functions as a structured cognitive and spiritual process. Through conscious recitation, the mind reframes perception, stabilizes attention, establishes psychological security, and prepares the nervous system for restorative sleep. In modern terms, the practice acts as a nightly cognitive reset. The final thought before sleep often becomes the framework through which the mind processes the entire night. And when that final thought acknowledges a reality greater than personal fear, the nervous system is finally permitted to release its tension. In that sense, the wisdom of Ibn Arabi reveals something remarkably simple. The quality of consciousness at night shapes the quality of consciousness the next day.